Hello folks, this is Mike. Welcome to the second and final installment of our kitchen island makeover. Now in part one, we took the old, unattractive, unfinished back and we made this nice faux panel look. Pretty, isn't it? In this video, we're going to take the old, unattractive, paper veneered and damaged top. We're going to resize it, we're going to resurface it and band it with red oak, stain it and varnish it. Now, or you could use the hardwood of your choice. Now this is the finished model. Turned out beautifully, didn't it? So stay tuned and I'll show you how we did it. Now before we get started, we'd appreciate it if you would go below and like our video. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell. That way we'll notify you of our upcoming videos. Also, I love answering your questions and comments personally, so be sure to send those to me. So now, let's build this top. So let's quickly talk about our strategy for the top. I want to cut this down flush with the cabinet sides and the front and the back. So I'm going to take a pencil, make a mark here, make a mark here, and we'll cut that down to size. Then I'm going to use this straight edge, put it through my table saw and cut the front off flush with the cabinet front. Then we'll sand this smooth, which is just paper veneer. We'll veneer the top and trim it. Then we're going to add 3/4 inch oak banding all the way around. Now the problem is we have this lip. So I'm just going to take a piece of this wood, our 1/4 inch wood for our trim in the back, and fill this in before we veneer it and band it. And that'll fill that gap and you'll never see that again because it's all going to be covered. The top is secured by these metal pegs or fasteners, and I want to still be able to use this mounting system when we're done. Also, we'll have to turn our top upside down to do our cuts because the pegs will be in the way. Now I'm only going to rip off about 1/8 of an inch. To cross cut the ends, I'll have to use my crosscut sled. Now the miter saw just doesn't have enough capacity. And when I set up my cut, I want to make sure that my saw blade tooth, the edge just barely kisses that line. When you cut through, you should still have most of your line left. That will give us a good flush fit. Now I've reinstalled the top and I made sure we had a good flush fit. So now I'm going to mark the filler piece, both for the length and for the width. Now we can go to our saw and we can cross cut it for length and then take it to the table saw and rip it to the correct width. Now we can test fit it and then we can get set up to glue it in place. Since we're going to sand off the paper veneer, we really don't need to worry about getting glue on it. What I do want to worry about is making sure I don't glue it to the bottom of the cabinet. So we're going to insert some wax paper here to keep that from happening. Now we apply glue to the table edge and our filler piece just like we did before, and then we're going to clamp it to the table. Now this piece of wax paper is to prevent my clamping components to sticking to either my table or to my cabinet. When the glue dries and we remove our clamps, the next step will be to sand the top. And here I'm going to use, of course, medium and fine sandpaper till all the paper veneer is gone. And we want to make sure we have a good smooth top when we're done, so it'll hold the glue really well. Instead of using traditional veneer, I have an old door skin left over from another job made of red oak, has a beautiful grain, and these are about 1/8 of an inch thick. So I'm going to cut it down to where it's about 1/4 inch lap over all the way around, and we're going to use that in lieu of veneer. You want to clean both surfaces really well. If you have a kernel of sawdust or some artifact between the two pieces, that will cause a high spot in your top when you glue it up. And since it's just veneered plywood, you can't sand it out because you'll sand your veneer right off. I'm using yellow glue again, and I'm putting a liberal coat on the table side and on the back of the oak skin. I'm using a brush because that's what I had in the shop. A glue roller would have been a much better choice, would have been faster and would have put on a much more even coat. And I may have applied it a little too liberally because when I put the weights and the board in the middle, it started moving around on me, and I kept having to adjust and reposition it until finally I had to put a clamp assembly around the perimeter of the board. But I always like to put the weights on first so the pressure can force the excess glue out of the middle part toward the edges. And we're also going to need to clean up all that excess glue that's dripping down the side before it dries. I let it sit a few hours, and then I removed the weights and the clamps. Then I routed off the overhang with a bottom piloted router bit. Then I used a little fine sandpaper to clean up the edges. Sometimes you get a little slight splintering or burring around the edges. Next, we'll cut our banding, or our side trim pieces, if you will. First, I run one side of my board through the jointer to true up the edge. Now, if you don't have a jointer, you can either buy or make a jointing jig like this one. This will give you a good straight cut. Just remember that this straight joint side will go against the table saw fence when we rip out our moldings to the proper width. So next we can find the thickness of our top and use this square setting to set the width of the cut on the table saw. And I'll set it maybe 1/64 oversized. That will allow us to sand off any blade burn or whatever. Now I'm cutting a piece of 1x8 red oak here. We will cut 3 strips out of this 6-foot long board, and then we will resize those to fit. And of course we'll check our fit before we move on. Next I clamp my pieces together and sand them until the top surfaces are smooth and flush. Cut a 45-degree angle on one end of your board and then loosely clamp it in place. Now use a 45-degree test block and fit it so that we have a good tight joint. Now you can use your square and lay out your locations for our biscuit joints. Allow about 1.5 inches from the edge of the board and then in intervals of 3 inches down the board, and be sure to mark both pieces. Now you could just as easily use dowel pins, a beadlock, or even a spline joint here. I just happen to like the biscuit joint. That done, we can mark the other end of our board carefully, and then we'll go to the miter saw and we'll cut that miter. And again, we want to test that with a 45-degree block. Make sure we have a tight joint on both ends. Now we go ahead and cut our biscuit joints for just one long side on both pieces, and then we go ahead and try them for proper fit. Then you can follow this procedure for the rest of the trim pieces, making sure that you test each miter for a good flush fit as you go along. I'll cut all 4 pieces using this method. However, there is a bit of a shortcut. You can cut the 2 long pieces first, fit them, cut your biscuit joints, clamp them to the board in place, and then simply position your other molding stick under these 2 miters like this and mark them. Now, positioning here is critical. Now, I had a little bit of lip that I could push the back of the molding against. Now, if you don't have this luxury, go ahead and clamp the board to the top in place where it belongs, and then you can mark the miters and then go cut them. And if you're careful, it should be dead on. During the fitting process, you may find that you have a biscuit or two cut too high or too low. This is no big deal. You can glue separate biscuits in each side of the joint into the top and into your molding. You can then cut them flush and then simply recut the joint. This can be caused by human failure, but it can also stem from your top being maybe dished or having a bow in it. These joints cut much more accurately on a level workpiece, so clamp it down and get it straight. Now once you have all 4 sides cut and dry fitted with your biscuits, make sure you have a smooth, level fit across both top and rail. I'm using a detail mini joiner here to insert biscuits to reinforce the miters. This one uses a number R3 mini biscuit, but the problem is still just a little too wide. And I don't want to cut a slot that shows through the top of the board, so I'm going to cut these slightly off center. You don't want that slot to be visible in the board from the top. Now again, we can dry assemble, and you can remove your pencil marks with denatured alcohol and a little elbow grease, and sand the top through 120 grit.
Now remember that if you over sand, you can remove the thin finish veneer right off the top. Modern veneers are very thin on plywood, so be careful here. Also, if your side molding is a bit too high, be sure to mark the high area, remove it, and sand it apart from the top, just to make sure you don't overdo it. One embellishment that can look very pleasing to the eye is to cut a shallow 1/8 by 1/8 inch notch along the inside edge of the molding. Now this adds a nice decorator touch that my wife really appreciates. Also, if you have trouble getting the edge perfectly flush with the top, this will help break that up and disguise the problem. However, this step is entirely optional. Many woodworkers will go ahead at this point and glue everything together. But I usually go ahead and stain everything first, making sure not to inadvertently seal over any glue surfaces. If you stain it first, you won't really have a problem with glue staining your project. The color of our stain is golden oak, which really looks good on red oak. And you can tell I've had this can a while. Now folks, we'll put a clickable link in the video description for this and the other products seen in this video. But a little disclaimer here, these are paid links and we will be compensated in a small way if you buy on them. Also remember that we're not being compensated by these manufacturers or any others to promote products. So we'll let the stain dry overnight and now we can finally glue it up. Here I've dry assembled the pieces without glue, and I'm going to concentrate on getting one end piece glued up and correctly positioned when it's attached to the top. Now you can make sure that your miters are good and tight here, and then clamp it in place for an hour until the glue dries. And while we're waiting, we can go ahead and start gluing up the long sides. Or you can just wait an hour and remove the clamps and then install the rest of the moldings. And this process is pretty straightforward. You just coat both sides of the biscuit with glue and push it into the slot, making sure it's centered and that it seats and goes all the way in. And next we can coat both sides of the exposed ends, also the surfaces and the little biscuits and the miters, and then coat both pieces with glue between the biscuits. You'll notice that there's a single dowel pin at the end of the board. And what happened was I really just messed up when I was laying out my biscuits. I failed to use that 1.5" guideline, got my biscuit too far from the end, so I substituted a dowel pin in that limited space to tighten up that joint on the end. And that really worked. When you finish putting on the glue, you can then tap on your moldings and make sure that the miters are good and tight. It's a good idea to clamp them in place, and then we need to allow a couple of hours for the glue to cure. Now once the glue is dry, the last step will be to remove the clamps from these 3 sides and then glue up the remaining end. Next, to protect my little grandkids, I'm going to use a sanding block and ease the sharp corners. And then I'm going to use a 1/8 inch roundover bit with a bottom ball bearing pollet, and I'm going to ease the top edge. And believe me, I can hear the wheels turning out in my audience, and people are saying, "But dummy, you've already stained it." And that's right, but we're going to apply another coat of stain, not only just to cover up the routing and sanding, but because I really want the finish to be darker. I opted not to use sanding sealer on this project because we like the light dark contrast in red oak. It really makes the grain stand out. Once again, we let the stain dry overnight, and I'm going to follow up with 3 coats of White-Pone Watco polyurethane. Now you could use Odie's oil or another type of finish here with great results, but since it's for kitchen use, I lean more toward durability than anything else. And we're going to let it dry overnight after each coat, and we're going to buff in between coats with a fine Scotch-Brite type pad.
So we finished our last coat of varnish. It's good and dry. So the last thing to do is just check it for fit. So let me see if I can get these pegs in the right place. There we go. Oh yeah, I think that looks nice. Look how it goes with that panel. I'm really happy. But I better get an expert opinion. Hey babe, can you come here? What do you think? Do you like it? Does it meet your approval?
I think you did a fine job on
Well,
it.
great. So you're happy with it?
I'm happy with it.
Well, folks, if Mama's happy, everybody's happy, and I'm certainly happy. So let's look at some before and after pictures of the whole project. And as you can see, we've really turned an ugly duckling into a beautiful swan here. And the best thing of all, we did it with basic power tools. We used a table saw, a miter saw, router, and basic woodworking tools. And it just turned out great. And of course, a lot of good planning and good execution. So folks, we hope you've enjoyed this project. So if they enjoyed the project, what should they do?
They should like the video.
And what else?
And then they need to subscribe and ring that bell.
And until next time, folks, thanks for watching.